My sister-in-law worked tirelessly to weave a web of intrigue just to destroy my marriage. In the end, it was my own husband who asked for a divorce. And 3 days later, I didn't hesitate for a second. A bill for his nephew's tuition at an elite private school amounting to thousands of dollars arrived at my address. I ignored it that evening. I was busy preparing dinner myself. A large serving of rich beef pot roast with a thick gravy, steamed fish with ginger and scallions, sautéed broccoli with garlic, and the sweet and sour chicken that Tony always requested. Tony was my sister-in-law's son. Whenever he visited, he was always affectionate and asked me to cook that specific dish for him. I stood in front of the stove for nearly 2 hours, shifting between heavy pans. The smell of hot oil mixed with steam felt like it was choking my throat, and I felt nauseous. I knew something was different with my body these past few days. Even the scent of raw fish or oil made me feel unwell, but I endured it. I didn't complain one bit. As dusk fell, my sister-in-law Jessica arrived with her son. She had a habit of acting as if she owned the house. So, as she pushed the door open, she simply tossed her shoes onto the floor, sprawled out on the sofa, and opened her phone to watch short videos. The volume was so loud, my head began to ache. Her shrill laughter and the blaring music from the living room reached all the way to the kitchen, mingling with the voice of my mother-in-law, Carol, who was at the dining table. She took a napkin, pointedly wiped a perfectly clean spot on the table, and chewed, "Oh dear, still a bit sticky here." While looking at the floor, she added, Jessica mentioned she noticed some dust in the corner last time she was over, and during Jessica's last visit, she had apparently noticed dust in a corner. I checked the time on my phone. It was 5:40 p.m. My husband, Michael, usually came home from work around 6. I washed my hands. I arranged the food on serving plates. I set out the silverware. I tried to make the table setting more special than usual. I wanted this day to be just for the two of us. I planned to tell him after dinner about the new life growing inside my belly. I was 2 months pregnant. Last week at my OBGYN checkup, the doctor said the baby's heartbeat was strong, the implantation was secure, and everything was in order. On my way home from the clinic, I cried with joy. 7 years of marriage didn't mean we didn't want a child. It was just that every time our hopes ended in disappointment. This time, I wanted to create a happy atmosphere at dinner to share the good news with him. But Jessica arrived. She always appeared at the most opportune moments, and sometimes I couldn't tell if it was a coincidence or a cunning calculation. Whenever my husband and I were about to discuss something personal, whether it was about money, my mother-in-law, or planning for a child, she would inevitably appear at the door. The peaceful atmosphere would immediately shatter. Just as I placed the platter of chicken on the table, Tony reached out his hand to grab a piece. Jessica immediately slapped her son's hand with a fake tone of discipline while glaring at me. "Wait for your uncle to arrive. There should be rules at the dining table." After saying this, she herself grabbed a chicken wing. She twirled it around and smirked mockingly. "It looks a bit burnt, probably too much sauce. If I were the one cooking, someone who earns a 6-figure salary, we wouldn't be eating this kind of food," she sneered. I said nothing. I just went back to the kitchen to get the soup. In this house, the more you explain, the more you make things difficult for yourself. If I said one word, Jessica would twist it into 10. If I reacted, she would immediately start crying, listing all she had done, her hardships, and how difficult it was to be a single mother, raising a child alone. My mother-in-law would instantly defend her daughter, and Michael would usually just remain silent. And sometimes that silence was more exhausting than any reprimand. At 6 p.m. the door opened. Michael walked in. His shirt was perfectly pressed, his hair was neat, and he carried a faint scent of expensive cologne. He would be turning 35 this year. He held the position of head of the technical department at a large IT company in Midtown Manhattan with an excellent salary. To everyone, he was a successful man responsible for his family. My mother-in-law boasted to everyone she met about how capable her son was and how her daughter, despite a failed marriage, lived a comfortable life because her younger brother helped her. Michael greeted his mother and sister. He glanced briefly at me and went to the bathroom to wash his hands. Jessica immediately followed him. Her voice became soft and pleading as if pouring out all her suffering. Michael, I'm so glad you're here. Your wife has been shopping up a storm again. A delivery came this afternoon, 3 huge boxes. Money is hard to earn. It doesn't just grow on trees. Why does she have to be so extravagant? Michael came out of the bathroom, his brow furrowed. He looked at me. What did you buy this time? I was about to say they were things for my pregnancy, special food, loose-fitting clothes, and some books about motherhood. But when I saw Jessica standing beside him with her arms crossed, and my mother-in-law raising her head, waiting for my answer, I swallowed those words. I just bought some necessities. What necessities come in 3 large boxes? Jessica laughed. You just stay at home. You don't work. Your old house dresses and shorts are good enough. Don't be so wasteful. I turned and looked her straight in the eye. Maybe because at that moment with a life inside me, I no longer felt alone. For the first time in a long time, I didn't want to back down. The money I spent was my own money. When those words left my mouth, a deafening silence fell over the table. Jessica was the first to react. Her face darkened. Did you all hear that? She eats my brother's food, lives in my brother's house, and then has the audacity to say it's her own money. My brother works himself to the bone to support this entire household, and you just sit here enjoying yourself and counting whose money is whose. My mother-in-law also put down her plate. Her voice was soft but sharp. Altha, honey, don't be so transactional. When you're married, you become a team. There's no my money or his money. There's only our money. You should be happy that you're in a position to contribute to the whole family. I looked at Michael, hoping he would say at least one fair word. Just one sentence would have been enough to say that I had never spent his money on luxuries. Since we got married, I was often the one who covered daily expenses, especially since Jessica always brought her son here to eat and stay over. The payments for tutors, school, insurance, and countless other costs all passed through my hands, but Michael just looked at me with a cold, distant gaze. If you're going to talk like that, he said, maybe we should just get a divorce. I heard it and thought I had gone deaf. The word divorce was uttered so lightly, as if he were just dusting off his shoulder. Beside him, Tony took the opportunity to snatch a piece of fried chicken and began to eat greedily. Jessica smirked slightly. It was so fast, but I saw it. My mother-in-law continued sorting the rice as if nothing had happened, as if that sentence were just ordinary dinner conversation. I stared at the man I had loved for 10 years and been married to for 7. Back when we were students, he would wait under my dorm window from dawn just to bring me warm bread rolls. My family was strongly against our relationship because we came from different social standings, and my parents feared I would only see suffer if I married a man from out of state, but I followed him to New York anyway. I left a stable job in my hometown. I ignored my parents' anger simply because I believed this man would love me until the end. In the first year of our marriage, he was truly wonderful. Every weekend, we ate out. On special occasions, he never forgot to give me gifts. And when we went back to my hometown, he always brought presents for my parents. Everything changed when Jessica was caught having an affair, and her husband kicked her out. To make matters worse, she lost her job shortly after. She moved in with us temporarily, claiming she needed time to heal and get back on her feet. Since then, she had become a burden to her mother and brother. First, it was supposed to be for a few months. Then it became years, and she slowly destroyed our marriage, complaining to Michael that I was ungrateful, that I looked down on his family, that I spent money like water, and that I didn't respect his mother. A version of the story repeated day after day until, without realizing it, Michael began to believe it. I put my fork down on the table. My voice was so calm that I surprised myself. A divorce, then, so be it. Michael turned pale. Jessica also raised her head. Perhaps no one in their family expected me to accept the offer so quickly. I unlocked my phone and showed Michael my online order history. One by one, look closely. I bought prenatal food, maternity clothes, and books about childcare. I'm 2 months pregnant. Michael's face went white. His lips trembled, but he couldn't say a word. But Jessica was the first to jump in. Impossible, you're lying to keep your husband from leaving you. Every time a divorce is mentioned, you use your belly. Michael turned to his sister and weakly told her to be quiet, but there was still doubt in his voice. My mother-in-law spoke slowly. Her tone was soft but icy. If you're really pregnant, that's good news, but don't use it to force Michael's hand. I suddenly laughed. Throughout the entire dinner, no one had asked if I was tired, if the baby was healthy, or if I had seen a doctor. The news of my pregnancy was to them merely a tool for negotiation. I put the phone in my pocket and enunciating each word clearly, I said, I'm not forcing anyone. Michael wants a divorce. I agree. I will give birth to this child and raise it on my own. Michael's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? If we're getting a divorce, why would you have the baby? I already told you I will raise the child by myself. The room fell silent for a moment, and then Jessica burst into loud laughter. Her laugh was as sharp as needles. Great if you're so brave. Go on, go back to your parents and raise that child. But don't you dare come crawling back here begging for forgiveness. I didn't argue anymore. I went straight to the bedroom. I took out a suitcase and packed a few clothes, my personal documents, my pregnancy medical records, and a few valuable items. After 7 years of marriage, I realized I had very few personal belongings in this house. When I dragged the suitcase into the hallway, Jessica was finishing the last of the chicken on the platter. Tony was clutching a can of soda. My mother-in-law was finishing her glass of wine, and Michael was sitting on the sofa smoking a cigarette. No one stopped me. I stood by the door, put on my shoes, and turned to Jessica. Jessica, I told you one day you will regret this, she sneered. Regret losing the person who pays the bills. Go ahead. I didn't answer. I opened the door and stepped out. It wasn't until I was in the elevator that I noticed my hands were shaking. Down in the lobby, I booked a car to the Port Authority bus terminal. I bought a ticket for the last bus to my hometown in upstate New York where my parents lived. On the bus, I sent a message to Michael. Prepare the divorce papers and send them to me. I won't fight for the apartment. I'll raise my child alone, he replied very quickly. Okay. I stared at the screen for a few seconds and then typed another sentence. By the way, Tony's tuition for next semester is $15,000. For all those years I was the one paying for it. From now on, you can handle it. After 3 minutes, the phone screen lit up. Michael asked, What do you mean? I locked the screen and leaned my head against the seat. Outside the window, the city lights were slowly fading behind me. Only then, finally, did my tears fall. Not because I still hoped for anything, but because I finally realized that for those 7 years what I was trying to save wasn't a family, but a temporary shelter that depended entirely on my patience. And when that patience ran out, it turned out I was the one who had to leave. The bus arrived at the terminal in my upstate town close to midnight. The night was damp. After a light rain, the asphalt shimmered under the streetlights, and the breeze outside the terminal carried a slight chill. I dragged my small suitcase down the steps. Amidst the quiet crowd, I saw my mom and dad waiting for me. Mom was wearing a thin cardigan, her hands clutching the strap of her purse tightly. Dad stood beside her, his back still as straight as ever, but his hair had more white since the last time I came home. When she saw me, Mom rushed over. Her gaze fell on my suitcase, then on my pale face, and finally rested on my belly, as if a mother's instinct had already told her everything. Before I could speak, she didn't ask any questions. She just reached out and cupped my cheek. Her hand was warm, but it was trembling. You're home, sweetie. With that one sentence, I almost broke down in sobs. For 7 years as a daughter-in-law, I had heard enough hurtful words, reproaches, and lectures on how a woman should endure. But I had forgotten that there was a place in this world where all I had to do was return. And it didn't matter if I was right or wrong, they would always be the first to open the door for me. My father took my suitcase. His voice was deep. Let's get to the car, it's late. On the way home, the car passed through familiar streets. The bakery on the corner was closed. The small shop near my old school still had the same sign. The trees at the gate of our subdivision had grown so much that their branches now brushed against one side of the road. I looked out the window and suddenly felt like someone returning from a very long journey. So long that only when you come back do you understand that the place you once called home is the only place where you are allowed to be weak. Mom sat beside me. She tried to ask something several times but stopped herself. In the end, she just held my hand tightly. "Did you and Michael have a fight?" I was silent for a few seconds and then whispered, "We're getting a divorce, Mom." Mom took a deep breath. My dad's shoulders, visible as he drove, tensed slightly, but he didn't turn around. I continued as if afraid that if I stopped, I wouldn't have the courage to go on. "I'm 2 months pregnant. I want to have this baby. If Michael doesn't want it, I'll raise it on my own." It became so quiet in the car that I could hear the gentle swish of the wipers on the windshield. Mom looked out the window, wiping the corner of her eyes. Dad slowed down and said in a heavy but very clear voice, "Thank God you came home. We can deal with everything else together." I lowered my head. Tears fell onto the back of my hand. I was prepared to hear my dad scold me, for my mom to nag me for not listening to them back then. I thought they would bring up how they had objected to Michael, that this was my choice. And now I had to face it all alone. But no, my parents didn't say a single word that would hurt me further. And for that understanding, I felt an immense debt of gratitude to them. When we got home, Mom took me to my old room. In 7 years it had barely changed. The floral curtains, the desk by the window, the bookshelf where some novels I never finished in college still sat. Mom had already laid out clean bed sheets, and on the table was a picture of warm water and some crackers. She paused at the door, looked at me, and said softly, "Honey, if you want to cry, you can cry tomorrow. If you want to talk, we'll talk, but for now, just get some sleep." I nodded. Mom closed the door. Left alone in the room, I placed my hand on my stomach. It was still flat with no obvious shape, but I knew that inside a life was forming, dependent on me, small but strong. I whispered, "Sweetheart, we're home now." The next morning, I was awakened by the smell of chicken soup from the kitchen. Mom had prepared a comforting chicken soup with rice and fresh vegetables. She said, "Pregnant women who travel late at night shouldn't eat anything too greasy." Dad was sitting at the table reading the newspaper. When he saw me come down, he folded it. "Eat, then I'll take you to the lawyer." I froze. "You already have a lawyer." Dad poured me a glass of warm water. "I called Leo last night, an old colleague of mine from work. His daughter is a lawyer who specializes in divorce and family law. Divorce cases shouldn't be decided rashly. You're pregnant, so everything has to be clear." I looked at my dad and my heart warmed, but at the same time it odd. My father had always been a man of few words, never overtly showing his affection. When I decided to marry Michael, he was the one who objected the most. At the airport before I flew to New York, he had said only one sentence: "If you can't take it anymore, come home." Back then I was angry, thinking he didn't believe in my love. Only now did I understand. It wasn't a prohibition, but a door he had intentionally left open for me. After breakfast, I opened my phone. 3 missed calls from Michael, 5 messages from Jessica, and 1 from my mother-in-law. I hadn't read Jessica's messages, but I could guess their content. And I was right. She called me selfish. Said that at the slightest problem, I ran to my parents and that I had deliberately sabotaged my husband's family by revealing the issue with Tony's school fees. My mother-in-law's message was gentler, but each word was like a needle. "As a wife, you should know how to endure. A woman's greatness is measured by her ability to keep the family together. Think about the stress this will cause everyone. Altha, a messy divorce is the last thing anyone needs, especially with a baby on the way. You are tearing this family apart over money." I stared at that message for a long time and then locked the screen. The old me would have surely explained, called to apologize even if I wasn't at fault. But that morning, sitting in my parents' kitchen, listening to my dad washing glasses in the yard and my mom picking fresh vegetables, I suddenly realized that those words no longer had the power to intimidate me. Around 9 a.m., a courier called saying a document had been sent from New York. I went downstairs to sign for it. The envelope had Michael's name on it. Inside was a draft of a waiver of rights and a separation agreement he wanted me to sign before filing for divorce. I opened it, and the more I read, the colder I felt. He was asking me to voluntarily leave the apartment, not to pursue a division of assets acquired during the marriage, not to ask for alimony for myself, and not to bring up any money spent during our time together. Regarding our future child, only a vague sentence was written. Both parties will discuss this issue in the future. I smiled bitterly. Michael had moved faster than I expected. Last night he had thrown out the word divorce in a fit of anger, and this morning he had already sent papers for me to sign, as if he had been waiting for this opportunity for a long time. I brought the documents into the house. Dad's face darkened after reading them. Mom slammed a glass of water on the table. "What does he take you for? Alpha?" "Yes, my name is Althea, the name my parents gave me, hoping their daughter would grow up to be noble, educated, and respectful. I had lived by the rules of proper conduct for so long that others began to think I couldn't feel pain. That same day after lunch, I met with the lawyer. Her name was Attorney Davis. She was in her 40s, petite, but with a very sharp gaze. She read the draft agreement, then raised her head and looked at me. "Your husband did this to make sure you'd leave with nothing. But the law doesn't operate on one person's greed. He's trying to trick you into waiving your rights." Miss Davis said that since we didn't have a prenuptial agreement under state law, our acquired assets were subject to marital property laws. Furthermore, you have every right to recover all the money from your personal savings that you spent on his family's obligations, plus any corresponding increase in property value. You have a full right to claim a share of that. And regarding the future child, child support is his legal right. You cannot waive your child's rights just because of pride. I lowered my head. I just don't want to have any connection with him anymore. Miss Davis spoke gently. Because you want this to end quickly. Everything must be clear. Being kind doesn't mean letting others take what is rightfully yours. You've suffered enough. It's time to protect yourself and your child. I fell silent. Then I opened my bag and took out a small flash drive and a stack of printed documents. These were the things I had secretly collected over the past 3 years. Receipts for Tony's school fees. Checks for Jessica's medical insurance. Bank statements of monthly transfers to my mother-in-law, screenshots of conversations where Jessica borrowed money and never returned it, and even private messages where she said my savings would just go to waste if I didn't spend them. Miss Davis flipped through the pages, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "How long have you been collecting these?" "From the day Jessica first told Michael I was just a freeloader in his family," I replied. "Back then, I wasn't thinking of suing. I just wanted that if he ever wanted to listen, I could prove I wasn't what they said I was." Miss Davis looked at me for a long time. Her voice became warmer. "In that case, we will use all of this not for revenge, but to restore justice to its rightful place." I nodded. Leaving the lawyer's office that evening, I received a call from Michael. I didn't answer. He called again and then sent a message. "What are we going to do about Tony's school payment?" The administration sent a notice to my office. "Don't put me in such an embarrassing situation." I stood under the blooming trees outside the office, watching the leaves fall onto the sidewalk, and replied briefly. "From now on, paying for your sister's son's school is your responsibility. I used to pay out of goodwill as family. Now that goodwill is gone." This time, Michael didn't reply immediately. Maybe he was doing the math. Maybe for the first time, he saw the figure tens of thousands of dollars in front of him and realized that for all those years, what he considered my obligation was actually built on my family's blood, sweat, and tears. That night, Mom brought me a glass of warm milk in my room. She sat on the edge of the bed and stroked my hair, just like when I was a little girl. "Althea, Mom isn't afraid of you getting a divorce. What I'm afraid of is you continuing to suffer because you're scared of what others will say." I leaned my head on my mother's shoulder. For the first time in many years, I didn't feel alone. Somewhere in New York City, Michael was probably furious. Jessica was likely screaming that I was ungrateful. My mother-in-law was probably complaining to relatives about how shameless I was. But here in my old room, my mom was beside me, my dad was quietly arranging everything for me, and the child in my womb was reminding me that my life doesn't end with one wrong marriage. That night, I couldn't sleep right away. Lying in my familiar bed, I stared at the ceiling where a small crack still existed from my high school days. I suddenly felt lighter. Not because all the problems were solved, but because I no longer had to force myself to be liked by anyone. To say these feelings out loud might sound selfish, but only someone who has suppressed themselves until they've forgotten who they are can understand how precious it is to finally breathe freely. The phone next to my pillow vibrated a few times. I didn't need to look to know who was calling. Michael called 2 more times and then gave up. A short message followed. There's no need to blow this out of proportion. We can talk about everything. I stared at those words for a long time. In the past, whenever he said we could talk, I was always the one to give in. I would talk, he would listen, but he would still choose to believe others. Now that I didn't want to talk, he suddenly brought up talking. Some things are just too late, and any conversation would be too late as well. I didn't reply. I turned off the phone and placed my hand on my stomach. The baby wasn't kicking yet, but I could feel its presence like a strong thread pulling me back to reality. I whispered so softly it was almost to myself. Mom won't let you live in these conditions. The next day, I went with my dad to the lawyer's office again. Miss Davis had prepared our response to the divorce petition. She explained every point to me where my legal rights were, and where Michael's legal obligations, which he could not escape. Lay, you have to stand firm, she said, her tone calm but certain. This isn't about taking what isn't yours. It's about a fair division. You are not taking his property, you are only taking back your share. I nodded. The words were logical, but not so easy to accept. For 7 years, I was used to stepping back. I was used to thinking that in a family, there shouldn't be petty calculations. But in the end, because I didn't count, they assumed it was all theirs. Miss Davis opened her laptop and showed me the list of expenses I had given her. Each number appeared on the screen, clear, cold, and emotionless, but it made my heart beat faster. The amount of Tony's tuition each year, monthly support for my mother-in-law, insurance payments for Jessica, money for groceries, apartment repairs, medical treatments. It all added up to a sum I had never tried to calculate. You spent over $40,000 of your own money in 7 years, Miss Davis said. And during this time, you had almost no personal income. All of this came from your personal savings before you got married. And this is the main argument. I stared at those numbers and in my mind, every event replayed. When Tony entered 1st grade, Jessica cried, saying she had no money for the down payment on the school. I sent it to her. When my mother-in-law complained of back pain and needed money for acupuncture, I gave her extra. When Michael said we needed to save more to pay off the mortgage faster, I became even more hesitant to touch his money. When I was doing all of this, I considered it a natural duty for a wife. Who would have thought that in the end this natural act would become the clearest proof of the injustice I had experienced? That afternoon when I got home, the phone rang again. Michael's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated for a moment but still answered. "Where are you?" he asked. His voice was softer than yesterday. "At my parents' house. I need to talk to you. Go ahead." There was silence on the other end. Then Michael sighed. "About Tony's school. Can you help me one last time? You were always the one who handled it. You just suddenly dropped everything. Jessica can't just find that kind of money." I smiled slightly, but there was no joy in that smile. "Michael, let me ask you something. In those 7 years, did you ever once ask where the money for Tony's education came from?" He fell silent. "You just knew I was handling it and considered it my obligation. Now that I've stopped paying, you suddenly feel the pressure." "It's not that I didn't know," Michael answered nervously. "I just thought it was a family matter, right?" "A family matter," I replied. "But I was part of that family too. And when Jessica called me a freeloader, you were silent. When your mother called me wasteful, you were silent until the moment I said I spent my own money. You asked for a divorce." Silence reigned on the other end again. I didn't wait any longer. As for Tony's matters, you guys can handle them from now on. He's your nephew, not my responsibility. I hung up before he could speak. My hands were trembling slightly, but my mind was completely calm. Perhaps when a person finally says what they've been holding back for so long, they are no longer afraid. That same day, my mom took me to the supermarket. She carefully selected each product, from milk and fresh vegetables to some loose-fitting loungewear. Every time she looked at me, her gaze grew warmer, as if she wanted to make up for the years she wasn't by my side. "Are you planning to stay here for good?" Mom asked. "Yes, Mom, I'll give birth here." Mom nodded, not asking any more questions, but I knew she was thinking a lot, holding back for fear of pressuring me. But all her concern was shown in these small, caring gestures. That night, my dad called me into the living room. He placed a small passbook in front of me. "This is the savings account your mom and I opened for you back when you were getting married. I wanted to give it to you then, but you refused to take it. Now take it." I was stunned. "Dad, I don't need it. I still have my own money." Dad shook his head. "This isn't just for you, it's for your child too. Your mom and I are getting old. We can't help much anymore, but at least you should have a financial cushion." I took the passbook, my hands trembling. For the first time, I clearly felt that I hadn't lost everything. I had lost my marriage, but I still had my family, a child in my womb, and myself. Lying in bed that night, listening to the distant sound of the wind from the sea, the phone screen lit up again. This time, it wasn't Michael, but an unknown number. I opened the message. "Altha, you left for your parents' house without even telling me. That's going too far." It was Jessica. I read it and didn't reply. A second later, a second message arrived. "You think a divorce will solve everything? You think you've won? Don't forget, you're still a daughter-in-law in our family." I looked at the screen and turned off the phone. There are people who, even after you've left their lives, still try to pull you back with invisible threads, but this time, I wouldn't let them pull me. I placed my hand on my stomach and closed my eyes. Outside the window, the wind hummed in sync with the breathing of my own hometown. I knew there was still a lot to do. Many difficult days ahead and unavoidable confrontations, but somehow from now on, I chose to be on my own side, and I would not look back. The following days passed without the scandal I feared. No one came to our house to make a scene. No shouting, no fighting, like the stories you often hear from acquaintances. Everything happened in silence. And that silence made me understand that when a person's heart grows cold, everything can collapse completely and without warning, even without harsh words. I began to get used to the rhythm of life at my parents' house. In the morning, I would wake up with Mom. We would go to the market to pick out fresh vegetables and fish. In the afternoon, I would help her cook, and in the evening, I would sit in my room reading books and writing down what needed to be prepared for the baby's arrival. Things that seemed boring to me now provided a deep sense of peace. My belly began to grow slightly. Every time I looked in the mirror and saw these small changes, my heart filled with a quiet joy. This baby was growing every day, oblivious to the turmoil of the adult world. It didn't know its parents were separating. It didn't know about the fights outside this house. All it knew was how to depend on me for life. Thinking of this, I understood that I needed to be stronger. One afternoon, as I was sitting and calculating the estimated expenses for the coming months, my dad called me into the living room. On the table was a large envelope. My name was written on it. I immediately recognized Michael's handwriting. "He must have sent more documents," Dad said in a level voice. I opened the envelope. Inside was not a new draft of the agreement, but a thick folder of documents bearing the seal of the law firm Michael had hired. I looked through the pages. The essence was still the same, but this time some more detailed points had been added, including a clause that in the case of deliberate delays to the divorce process or the filing of unjust demands for the division of property, the husband's side would consider the possibility of filing a countersuit. I stopped reading, not because I was surprised, but because now I could see Michael's true character more clearly. He was no longer the man who used to wait for me under my dorm window. Now he was in the position of someone ready to defend his interests by any means, even if it meant making me his enemy. My mom, standing beside me, glanced at a few pages and shook her head. He's deliberately trying to pressure you, honey. My dad was silent and then he spoke. The more he pressures you, the more we must strictly follow the law. They won't leave you with nothing. I nodded. The next day, I took the documents to Attorney Davis. She studied them carefully and placed the papers on the table. He's trying to pressure you emotionally, she said. But as long as we have sufficient evidence, they can't do anything. I just don't want this to drag on, I admitted honestly. I just want it to be over because you want this to end quickly. We must be careful. Michael thinks you'll weaken. If you back down, they will attack. If you stand firm, they will have to adjust. I thought for a moment and asked, what's our next step? We will prepare our own petition for divorce, she answered firmly. We will use financial abuse and psychological incapacity as strong grounds to expedite the process. We won't wait for them anymore. We will be the first to act. I was taken aback by those words. All this time, I had been the responsive party, always waiting for others to make a move before finding a way to respond. This was the first time I had to be proactive. I nodded. Okay, let's do it. That night, I sat with my parents and explained the situation to them. Dad didn't ask many questions. He just listened and occasionally nodded. In the end, he said only one sentence: act according to the law. Don't be afraid. Mom held my hand. Her voice was soft but firm. You're not alone anymore. Those two sentences were enough to make me feel strong. 2 days later, the petition was officially filed with the court. It included the request for the dissolution of the marriage, the division of marital property according to the law, and the establishment of obligations for child support after the baby was born. Additionally, Miss Davis asked the court to consider the expenses I had made during the marriage from my personal funds as a basis for the division of assets. After filing the petition, I stood outside the courthouse, watching the people pass by. I didn't feel as heavy as before. I knew that from this moment on, a new chapter had begun. This was no longer an internal family conflict that could be resolved behind closed doors, but a case that had to be examined by the court. That afternoon, Michael called. I answered. You filed a case? He asked directly. Yes. There was silence on the other end. Altha, what you did is beyond all bounds. I laughed bitterly. Where exactly did it cross the line? Why do family problems have to be brought to court? What will people say? It doesn't matter what people say, I answered slowly. What matters is, Michael sighed. I told you we could talk. You sent me a draft agreement where you asked me to leave with nothing. Is that what you call talking? He didn't answer immediately. After a moment, he said, I just thought that was the easiest way. Easy for you, I replied, but not for me. Silence reigned again. I understood that things were beginning to enter his mind that were never there before. But it was too late. Do you really have to take it this far? He asked in a heavy voice. From the moment you said the word divorce, it had already gone far, I replied. I hung up. This time my hands weren't shaking. In the following days, the summons from the court arrived. At the same time, I started receiving calls from Michael's relatives. Some advised me to be more patient. Some said I was making a big deal out of a small thing. One even accused me of ruining my husband's good name. I listened but didn't react. In the past, I might have doubted myself because of those words. But now, I had learned that other people's reputations should not be placed above your own life. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, Mom brought me a glass of warm milk. She sat on the edge of the bed, looked at me and asked, Are you scared, honey? I thought for a moment and shook my head. No, Mom, I just have regrets. Regrets about what? That I was blind for so long. Mom sighed and gently rubbed my back. It's a good thing you woke up. Many people go their whole lives without understanding. I looked at my mom and suddenly felt lighter. Yes, I had lost 7 years, but at least I hadn't lost my entire life. That night, I slept soundly. In my dream, I saw myself standing in front of a door. Behind it was the past, full of scandals and fatigue. Ahead was a path that was not yet clear, but the light above it was very soft. I stepped forward, not looking back. The next day, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun was slowly rising outside, and the sea breeze carried a distinct salty smell. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, looking at myself. The face was still the same, but the gaze had changed. It was no longer the look of someone always trying to be liked by everyone. It was the look of someone starting to learn to choose herself. I placed my hand on my stomach and smiled slightly. "We're going to be okay." The preparations for the pre-trial mediation continued at a slow but tense rhythm. On the outside, my life seemed like the ordinary life of a pregnant woman. Regular meals, doctor's visits, occasional walks with Mom at the market. But inside, I understood that I was approaching a line. Once crossed, there was no going back. One morning, when the summons for the hearing date arrived, I stood at the gate of the house for a long time. The letter was thin, but it felt incredibly heavy. I had prepared myself for this, but holding the paper, I still felt a lump in my throat. Not out of fear, but because now everything had become so real, and I could no longer pretend that nothing was happening. Mom noticed my state and came over, asking gently, "Are you leaving tomorrow?" "Yes, Mom." Mom nodded and said as if to calm herself, "There's nothing to be afraid of. Tomorrow, just tell the truth. Those who are in the right have nothing to fear." I smiled, but my heart was still heavy. The courage Mom spoke of was the result of her long years of living rightly and honestly, and I knew I was not at fault, but I still had to face the gazes and judgments of others. That night, I called Attorney Davis to clarify the details. She listened to me and said very clearly, "Tomorrow is just a hearing, not the trial itself. But you must be prepared. They might use various methods to force you to soften. Remember one thing, you don't need to defeat them. You just need to not be defeated by yourself." I fell silent and then replied, "I understand." After hanging up, I sat alone in my room, my hands resting on my stomach. The baby had started to make its presence felt, not with kicks, but with the very fact of its existence. Every decision I made now was no longer just for me. The next day, my dad drove me to the courthouse. Throughout the ride, he was silent. Just before I got out of the car, he said only one sentence: "Stay calm." I nodded, took a deep breath, and walked into the building. The judge's chambers were small, a long table, a few chairs, and a window facing the backyard. I arrived 5 minutes early. After sitting down, I felt my hands go cold, but my pulse was steady. About 5 minutes later, Michael entered. He was wearing a white shirt and trousers. He still looked neat, but his face looked tired. Behind him entered Jessica and Carol. When she saw me, Jessica sneered softly, and Carol just glanced at me and immediately turned away. Michael sat across from me. He looked at me for a few seconds, then lowered his eyes. "You've lost weight," he said softly. I didn't answer. I didn't know how to react to those words. Some phrases, when said at the wrong time, lose all meaning, even if they are sincere. The judge entered and began to read the essence of the petition and the demands of both sides. Everything was according to protocol, nothing unexpected. When the judge asked the other side to make a statement, Michael's lawyer spoke up. "Your Honor, my client leaves the decision regarding the status of their marriage to the court," he said in a formal tone. "But when it comes to property, we believe that most of it was earned by my client. Therefore, we strongly object to a 50-over-50 split." I listened without surprise. This was exactly what I had prepared for. The judge turned to me. "What is your opinion?" I looked straight ahead, my voice remaining calm. "I am not pursuing any assets Michael acquired before we were married. But for the assets accumulated during our marriage, I request a division according to the law." Jessica immediately interjected, her voice rising. "You've got some nerve. You just sat at home, not earning a single penny, and now you want to take half of my brother's assets." The judge reprimanded her, calling for order, but she wouldn't be quiet. "Tell the truth." Jessica turned to me, her gaze as sharp as a knife. "You ran to your parents and filed a lawsuit. Who else would marry you now with a child in tow?" I looked at her. For the first time in many years, I didn't feel anger. I just saw everything so clearly. "Jessica, you don't need to worry about that," I said slowly. "I can take care of myself." The atmosphere in the room grew tense. Michael's brow furrowed slightly. "Altha, don't talk like that. I'm just telling the truth," I replied. the judge moved on to the issue of child support. Hearing this, Michael hesitated for a moment. About the child? We can talk about that another day, he said. I shook my head. There's no need to talk about it another day. I will give birth to him and raise him. You have an obligation to pay child support according to the law. Jessica laughed bitterly. You talk as if you're 100% sure it's my brother's child. That sentence silenced everyone in the room. I looked her straight in the eye, not breaking my gaze. Jessica, you should be more careful with your words. Michael turned to his sister, his voice low but clear. That's enough. It was the first time in the entire hearing that he had truly defended me in front of his sister, but I felt nothing. If that sentence had been said years ago, the story might have been different. The hearing lasted almost an hour, but no agreement was reached. The judge decided that the case would proceed to a formal trial. As I stood up to leave, I felt a slight sense of relief. Not because the problem was solved, but because I hadn't backed down. In the hallway, Michael called out to me, Alpha. I stopped and turned. I want to talk to you. Seriously? I looked at my watch and nodded. We went to a quiet corner of the hallway. Do you really want to take this to court? He asked. I've already taken it, I replied. He fell silent. Then he said softly, I didn't expect it to turn out like this. I looked at him and there was a strange, hard-to-explain feeling in my chest. It wasn't resentment or leftover love. How did you expect it to turn out? Michael couldn't answer. Maybe we can just forget about the money, he continued, his tone lowering. Let's just separate amicably. I slowly shook my head. I've been forgetting about it for 7 years. That sentence wasn't said loudly, but it was enough to end the conversation. I turned and walked away. This time, I didn't hear him call me. Outside the courthouse, I saw my dad. He didn't ask anything, just looked at me as if to make sure I was okay. I smiled. It went well, Dad. He nodded and opened the car door for me. On the way home, I looked out the window. The city was still the same. People were still rushing about their business. Cars were running. Nothing had changed. Only I had changed. I placed my hand on my stomach and closed my eyes. This fight wasn't over, but I was no longer afraid. After the failed mediation, everything entered a new, clearer and colder phase. There was no more room for pleasantries or face-saving words. All that was left were documents, seals, and set schedules. I realized that once a marriage reaches the court, it's no longer a story of two people, but a case where right and wrong are weighed on the scales of justice, not emotion. While waiting for the first trial, I received almost no calls or messages from Michael. This silence made me understand that he had chosen his own way to deal with the situation. Perhaps preparing documents, consulting his lawyer, or simply convincing himself of his righteousness. Meanwhile, I maintained a steady rhythm of life. Every morning, I would take a walk, breathing in the fresh air. The doctor advised me to do light exercise for the baby. Sometimes, my mom would join me, telling stories about the neighbors or reminiscing about my childhood antics. These simple conversations warmed my soul like an invisible thread pulling me from a heavy past. One morning after coming home from the clinic, I answered a call from an unknown number. On the other end was the voice of an elderly woman. May I speak to Althea? Yes, this is she. This is Michael's aunt. I don't want to interfere in your problems, but I heard you took the case to court. That doesn't seem right. A husband and wife should resolve their problems within the family. When you aired your disputes in public, you can't face each other anymore. I was momentarily stunned, but replied calmly, Yes, Auntie, I understand, but there are problems that, if not clarified, will never end. You, as a woman, should be more tolerant, she continued. Michael has a hot temper sometimes, but he's not a bad person. By doing this, you're embarrassing him. Hearing this, I felt a familiar pain, the feeling that had been with me for 7 years. I always had to think of others to protect my husband's and his family's reputation, setting aside my own feelings. Yes, Auntie, I replied in a soft but firm voice. All this time I have tolerated a lot. But now, I want to live for myself and my child. There was silence on the other end. Then she said softly, You've changed. Yes, I said. If I hadn't changed, I wouldn't be myself anymore. The conversation ended. I put down the phone. My heart was no longer trembling as before. Perhaps when a person dares to speak their mind, they no longer depend on the opinions of others. That same day, Attorney Davis called me in. When I arrived, there was a new stack of documents on her desk. "The other side has submitted additional materials," she said. "They claimed that most of the family's expenses came from Michael's income, and that you were merely the manager of the money, not making a real contribution." I wasn't surprised. I knew Michael would choose that argument. "What do you think?" I asked. Attorney Davis looked at me with confidence. "Our evidence is stronger. All the transfers you made are recorded. The major expenses are also in your name. Most importantly, we can prove that the source of these funds was your personal savings before you were married." I nodded. I had been preparing for this for a long time. I just never thought I would actually use it. "And one more thing," the lawyer added. "They plan to request a DNA test after the baby is born." I frowned slightly. "They aren't 100% doubting it," she explained. "This is their way of wasting time and putting pressure on you. But you have nothing to worry about. If necessary, we will go through that process." I took a deep breath. "I'm not afraid." Attorney Davis smiled slightly. "I know." Leaving the office, I walked for a long time before calling a cab. The evening was cool in my hometown. The sea breeze carried the scent of damp earth. I walked slowly, holding my stomach, thinking about what would happen next. The trial wouldn't be easy. There would probably be more hurtful words and unexpected situations. But I knew I had already crossed the halfway point. At dinner, my dad said, "The first trial is next week." I nodded. "Yes, Dad." Mom looked at me worriedly but said nothing. She just put more food on my plate. "Eat a lot, honey. You'll need your strength." I smiled. "I'm fine, Mom." My dad put down his spoon. His voice was heavy but clear. "Whatever the outcome, you must not give up halfway." I looked at my dad, feeling his determination. I understood he wasn't just talking about the court case, but about my life in general. "Yes, Dad, I know." That night I didn't sleep right away. I sat by the window, watching the street. The lights came on, and the noise of traffic began to subside. I remembered my early years as a daughter-in-law. There were nights I sat like this, waiting for Michael to come home, hoping he would understand me better. Now I was sitting here thinking about myself, my future child, and a new life. The phone vibrated, a message from Michael. "The trial is next week. Be prepared." I looked at the text and replied briefly. I know he didn't write back. I turned off the phone and set it aside. There are conversations that no matter how long change nothing. What matters is not who said what, but who remains standing until the end. I leaned my back against the chair and closed my eyes. My chest no longer tightened with emotion as before. No anger, no regret, just utmost clarity and peace. Perhaps this is what it's like when a person truly lets go of a situation. I placed my hand on my stomach and whispered softly, "Mommy will be with you all the way." Outside, the wind blew gently, carrying the chill of the night. I took a deep breath, stood up, and turned off the light. Ahead was a new path, and I knew I would not look back. On the morning of the first trial, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because of nervousness, but because of a strange feeling, as if I were standing before a large gate I had to cross. I sat in front of the mirror, carefully arranging my hair, choosing a loose-fitting dress in a calm color. Mom stood behind me, watched for a moment, and said softly, "Just be calm today, honey. Just say what you truly went through." I nodded. Perhaps the word truth had never been so important to me. I didn't need to exaggerate or explain at length. It was enough to just say everything and let the court decide. My dad drove me to the courthouse. He was mostly silent during the ride, only reminding me to eat breakfast and conserve my energy. I understood his silence was not a lack of concern. He just knew I needed quiet to think. Entering the courtroom, I saw Michael already seated in his place. He was wearing a dark suit, his hair neat, but his face was weary. Beside him were his lawyer and Jessica. Carol sat in the back, her gaze filled with resentment. I sat in my place next to Attorney Davis. She gave me a slight nod as if to confirm we were ready. The trial began according to protocol. The atmosphere became more serious and tense as the judge started reading the case materials. Every question, every recorded answer, there was no room for emotion. Everything had to be clear. When it was our turn, Attorney Davis stood up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was incredibly persuasive. My client Althea, for 7 years of marriage, not only performed all household duties, but also used her personal funds to pay for a significant portion of the family's expenses. We have concrete evidence for every payment. Therefore, we asked the court to fully consider her financial contribution in the division of marital assets. She handed the court copies of the bank statements. One by one, I looked at those numbers without emotion. I had accepted the fact that what I once gave willingly must now be examined with justice. It was Michael's side's turn. His lawyer stood up and presented his objections. He spoke for a long time. The gist was that the majority of the family's income came from Michael and I was merely a financial manager. According to him, the expenses I made were voluntary. I listened without interrupting. I knew that in court, everyone has their own version. What mattered was not who said more, but who had evidence. When the judge asked me directly, I stood up. My voice remained steady. During our marriage, I did not have a stable income because I left my job to join my husband in New York. However, I had personal savings before we were married, and a large portion of the family's expenses came from this. I do not deny my husband's income, but I do not agree that all my efforts and investments should be devalued. After my words, there was silence in the court. I didn't look at Michael, but I could physically feel his gaze. When it came to the matter of the child, the tension increased. The judge asked about child support. Michael hesitated for a moment and then said, "I do not refuse responsibility, but I want to get clear confirmation after the child is born." I understood where he was going, just as Attorney Davis had warned. I nodded. I agree to follow all legal procedures. If necessary, I am willing to undergo any testing. This answer put everyone in their place. The trial lasted longer than expected. When the judge announced a recess for further study of the evidence, I felt exhausted. Whether from constantly standing and sitting or from the tension that lasted for hours, I didn't know. Leaving the courtroom, I walked slowly down the hall. My dad was waiting for me. He looked at me and asked, "Are you okay?" I nodded. "I'm fine, Dad." Attorney Davis, walking beside me, whispered, "You did everything you could today. Let the court be the judge." I thanked her, feeling my heart lighten slightly. At that moment, Michael came out of the courtroom. He stopped a few steps from me, hesitated, and then approached. "Althea," I turned. "I want to talk to you for just a minute." I glanced at my dad. He gave a slight nod. I stepped aside, keeping my distance. Michael looked at me, the expression in his eyes no longer the same. "You didn't have to take it this far." I didn't answer right away. I looked him straight in the eye. "And in your opinion, where is the limit?" Michael fell silent. Perhaps he didn't know either. He just thought that if I had compromised a little more, everything would have been easier. I slowly shook my head. I compromised for 7 years. There was no accusation in that sentence, only a statement of fact. But it was this that stripped him of any chance to object. He sighed. "I didn't know you were carrying so much." I looked at him and said, "It's not that you didn't know. You just didn't want to know." Michael was stunned. The light in his eyes dimmed. I knew those words might hurt him, but it was the truth he had to face. I said nothing more. I went back to my dad and we left the courthouse. On the way home, I barely spoke. I looked out the window at the streets. The city was living its usual life, but I was looking at it with different eyes. At home, Mom immediately asked how the trial went. I recounted everything. After listening, she said only one thing. "So, you've passed another stage?" I nodded. Yes, I had passed another stage, but not because of my patience as before, but because of my own choice. That night, I lay awake for a time, replaying the day's trial in my mind, the things I said, and the look on Michael's face when he heard my answers. I no longer felt the weight. Instead, there was a clear sense that I was on the right path. I gently caressed my growing belly. "We can do this, my child. The hardest part is over," I said softly. Outside, the wind gently caressed the curtains. I closed my eyes, letting my thoughts calm down. The road ahead was still long, but I knew I would walk it step by step without looking back. After the first trial, life didn't immediately return to normal, but it was no longer as tense. It was like the surface of water after a wave has passed. Now, it was beginning to calm, even if a strong current still flowed underneath. I had gotten used to it. Every week, I would call Attorney Davis to discuss the case's progress. We carefully prepared additional documents and responses for the other side. Sometimes I would spend hours with her reviewing every number in detail on the bank statements. I no longer felt tired. I was too focused. Perhaps when a person knows what they are fighting for, even fatigue finds meaning. One evening, I received a message from Michael. This time, it was longer than usual. Althea, I've looked over all the documents again. I understand you spent more than I thought, but you have to understand that I can't agree to a 50-over-50 split. I still want us to reach an agreement so this doesn't drag on in court. I read the message, put the phone aside, and didn't reply immediately. I no longer reacted rashly. I gave myself time to think, not out of doubt, but to ensure my decision wasn't based on a sudden emotion. That night, I told my parents about the message. Mom sighed. Only now does he understand how much you spent, but he still doesn't want to take responsibility. Dad was silent for a moment and then said, It's not that he doesn't understand. He's just calculating what's more favorable for him. I looked at my dad and suddenly understood everything. Before, when there was a problem, I always let my emotions rule. I thought if I was kind, people would appreciate it, but in reality, it doesn't always work that way. Some people will understand, but others will choose the path that only benefits them, even if it hurts others. I picked up the phone and replied to Michael. You had a chance to negotiate before I filed the case. Now, everything is under the law. I'm not changing anything. After sending the message, I felt an incredible sense of peace. Not a single shred of doubt. The next day, I went for a regular checkup. The doctor said the baby was developing well. All indicators were normal. Looking at the small image on the ultrasound screen, I smiled. In the midst of all the chaos, the baby continued to grow each day as if living in its own world, oblivious to the turmoil outside. Leaving the clinic, I went into a small coffee shop near the coast. I sat in my favorite corner, ordered a warm drink, and opened a small notepad. Since returning to my hometown, I had gotten into the habit of writing down my thoughts, not to remember, but to better understand myself. While writing, I heard a familiar voice. Looking up, I saw Andrew, my old classmate. He looked the same, tall, slim, with a friendly face, only his gaze had become more mature. Alpha, he greeted. I was slightly surprised. Andrew, it's been so long. He pulled up a chair and sat down. After the usual pleasantries, he looked at me and said, I heard your story. I wasn't surprised. This kind of news always gets around, even if it's not told directly. I'm okay, I said. Andrew nodded. I know you're okay, but not everyone could endure what you went through. I smiled weakly. It's not about strength. I just had no other choice. He fell silent and then said, Back then, when you decided to marry Michael, I thought you would suffer. I looked at him, feeling no resentment, only a slight regret. Why didn't you tell me then? And if I had, would you have listened? Andrew replied. I laughed, not answering. I already knew the exact answer. We talked for a little while longer. Andrew didn't delve into the details of the divorce. He talked about his job and his decision to move back to our hometown. This light conversation made me feel more comfortable. As we were about to leave, Andrew said, If you need any help, just let me know. I nodded. Thanks, Andrew. On the way home, I thought about that meeting, not because of Andrew himself, but because of the feeling of seeing someone who knew me before all this nightmare. Back then, I was myself, not weighed down by the roles of wife, daughter-in-law, and the person who had to shoulder all the problems. When I got home, I found my mom cleaning the living room. She looked at me and asked, Why do you look so happy? I smiled. Mom nodded, not asking questions, but her gaze warmed. It was enough for her to see that I felt a little lighter. That night, I received a notice from Attorney Davis. The date for the next trial had been set. There was little time left, and a final decision was near. I sat alone in my room, looking at the letter. I wasn't as nervous as before. I was ready. The road wasn't easy, but since I had come this far, I wouldn't stop. I felt a slight kick from within, as if the baby was also waiting for this moment. "It's almost over, my child," I whispered. Outside, the sea breeze carried familiar sounds. I closed my eyes, letting my heart calm down. Something had to end to make way for something new. The second trial took place on a cloudy morning. The cool weather was calming, but at the same time, it made one feel alert. I arrived half an hour early and sat on a long wooden bench in the courthouse hallway. Both hands rested on my stomach, feeling the life within me. My dad had driven me, but chose to wait outside the gate, repeatedly lighting the same brand of cigarette. My mom had been giving me numerous instructions since early morning, from how to speak correctly to the need to take care of my health. But as I was leaving the house, she just whispered, "Do what you think is right." Those words still echoed in my mind. A few minutes later, Attorney Davis approached with a thick stack of documents. "Today might be more intense than last time," she said calmly. "Stay calm. We have all the evidence." I nodded. I was no longer the woman who silently waited while others spoke for her. Entering the courtroom, I saw Michael. His face was not as composed as before. He glanced at me, his gaze lingering on my stomach for a moment before quickly looking away. Beside him was Jessica, tense, the former arrogance replaced by caution. The trial began. This time, the atmosphere was heavy, like the calm before a storm. In the first part, the division of property was discussed again. Michael's lawyer argued that my contribution was not equivalent to my demands, but Attorney Davis didn't just provide numbers. She laid out every expense item, every transfer, and every receipt I had saved for 3 years. I saw how Michael's face changed as each amount was mentioned, from annoyance to silence, and then to shame when Miss Davis mentioned the amount for Tony's 3rd year of school. Perhaps at that moment, he realized that all my words were not empty. After the property issue, the moment I had been waiting for arrived. Attorney Davis stood up. Her voice was clear. "We asked the court to pay attention to Miss Jessica's actions of soliciting money from the petitioner for purposes inconsistent with what was declared. We also provide additional evidence that she used the family relationship for personal gain." The tension in the court reached its peak. Attorney Davis produced a document. "These are screenshots of a private message conversation between Miss Jessica and a friend, which she left logged in on a shared tablet at Althea's home." She read it out loud and clear. Jessica's sharp and calculated message: "Let them pay, she's a fool. When her money runs out, she'll leave on her own." A deafening silence filled the court. I didn't look at Jessica, but I knew she was sitting there paler than paper. The judge asked to stop the recording and asked, "Respondent, do you have anything to say?" After a long silence, Jessica jumped up, her voice trembling. "That's not mine. Those chats are edited." Attorney Davis was unfazed. "We are prepared to submit the device itself for digital forensic analysis if the court requires it." Michael turned to his sister. His gaze was filled with utter confusion. "Jessica, what does all this mean?" he asked softly. Jessica just turned away. At that moment, I understood I didn't need to say anything more. The truth had come out on its own. The trial continued, but I no longer felt the pressure. When the judge announced a recess before giving a decision, I remained seated, my hand on my stomach. I wasn't looking for a grand victory. I just needed justice. A few moments later, as everyone began to leave, Michael approached me hesitantly. He stopped a short distance away. "Alpha," he called out deeply. I raised my head. I didn't know it was like this. I looked at him and replied very calmly, "You didn't know, or you didn't want to know." Michael fell silent. I didn't say anything more. For some questions, the answers no longer matter. I stood up and walked into the hallway. My dad was still there. When he saw me, he put out his cigarette. "Are you okay, honey?" I nodded. "Everything's fine, Dad." He didn't ask any more questions, just gently patted me on the shoulder. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes for a moment. I felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The trial wasn't over, but I knew that this time I was not the loser. After a short recess, the trial resumed. The atmosphere had changed. The tension was gone, replaced by anticipation for the final decision. I returned to my seat, my heart beating steadily. I had done everything I was supposed to do. The rest was no longer up to me. Michael also sat in his place. This time he only looked at the floor. Jessica sat silently, not even trying to look at me. The judge entered and banged the gavel. The final part was the closing arguments. Michael's lawyer stood up, but his voice was not as confident as before. He only asked the court for understanding regarding his client's financial obligations. When it was Attorney Davis's turn, she briefly summarized all the facts, my contribution, the evidence of expenses, and the chat messages proving Jessica's exploitation. "We ask for nothing but justice," she concluded firmly. Hearing those words, I felt a deep sense of relief. That was it. All I sought was not victory, but justice. The judge banged the gavel and announced a recess for deliberation. Silence filled the court. I stood up and walked into the hallway. My dad was still in the same place. He wasn't smoking anymore, just staring into the distance. "Honey, well, just wait for the verdict." I nodded, knowing how worried he was. I sat on the long bench. A while later, Michael came out and approached hesitantly. "Alpha," he called, his voice softer than usual. I looked at him without breaking my gaze. "I'm sorry," he said. This time, there were no excuses. I looked at him, feeling the sincerity in his words, but my heart no longer skipped a beat. "For what?" I asked calmly. Michael was surprised. "For not taking your side. For not offer." I slowly nodded. "Yes, you didn't believe me. But that's all in the past." There was a silence. Michael's gaze was full of regret, the look of someone who only realizes the value of something after it's lost. I want to fix things," he said. I smiled, a very faint smile of someone who understood everything. "Some things, Michael, can't be fixed." He froze, stood for a second, and then turned and left. His step seemed heavier than before. I watched him walk away without a shred of regret. The thing I could regret was long gone. Now I had just finally accepted it. Almost an hour later, we were called back into court. The judge declared that the case was submitted for resolution, and we would just have to wait for the official written decision. I sat for another moment, then stood up. Attorney Davis took my hand. "We did everything. Now we wait." I nodded. Leaving the hallway, I saw my dad. He didn't ask anything, just looked at me for a long time, and then nodded. I knew that for him, the most important thing was that I had fought for myself. Stepping out of the courthouse gate, I stopped for a moment and looked up at the sky. It was still cloudy, but the storm in my soul had finally subsided. Several months later, I was summoned to Attorney Davis's office. The written decision from the court had arrived. The petition for divorce was formally granted. Our relationship was officially over. Reading it, I felt an immense sense of relief. The door had finally closed. Regarding the assets, the court ruled to divide them, based on the evidence of my contribution. As for the money spent on Tony and taken by Jessica, the court decided to deduct this amount from Michael's share as he was the spouse who had enabled the fraudulent use of my trust. I imagined Michael's shoulders slumping when he learned he would bear the weight of his sister's actions and finally child support. The court ordered Michael to pay it in full, according to the law. After reading the entire decision, I cried with joy. "It's really over," Attorney Davis said with a smile. Leaving the lawyer's office, I stopped for a moment and took a deep breath. The storm in my soul had finally calmed. The phone vibrated. A message from Andrew. "Is it over?" I replied, "Yes." A moment later he wrote, "Then you can start your own life." I read those words and smiled softly. He was right. I was free now. I placed my hand on my stomach and whispered, "We're starting over." My child inside, I felt a slight movement in response. I walked forward slowly but surely, just like the entire path I had taken. After the court's decision, my life didn't suddenly change. But one thing was clear. I was no longer tied to the past. That door was permanently closed. I spent the first few days at home, not out of sadness, but to organize my thoughts. Mom continued her usual routines, cooking, cleaning, and occasionally asking, "How are you feeling now, honey?" Dad was quieter, but every morning he would faithfully place a glass of warm water for me. One evening, as we sat on the porch, Mom, knitting a baby sweater, asked softly, "Do you feel lighter?" I thought for a moment and nodded. "Much lighter, Mom." Mom sighed. "Thank God. In life you don't need grand things. What's important is to live without a heavy heart." A week later, I began to return to an active life. Doctor's checkups, light exercise, occasional trips to the market with Mom. These simple things gave me the peace I had long been searching for. Michael called a few times, but I didn't answer. Not out of anger, but because we had nothing left to talk about. One night, he sent a message. "I've transferred the money according to the court's decision. If you need anything else for the child, let me know." I read the message without emotion and replied briefly, "Received." From then on, our relationship was limited to his obligations to our child, nothing more. As time went on, I began to seriously think about work. I couldn't rely on my parents forever. I needed independence, not just for myself, but for my child's future. I remembered my experience in accounting, but I didn't want to go back to dry numbers and rigid schedules. I wanted to do something more meaningful. One morning, I told my parents I want to open a small business offering home-cooked meals on demand and catering. Mom was a little surprised, but Dad only asked one thing: "Have you thought it through carefully?" I nodded. "No detailed plan yet, but I want to start gathering information. I don't want to just sit at home and wait." Dad didn't object, just offered a reminder. "If you start something, finish it. Don't leave it halfway." In the following days, I started researching suppliers, calculating costs. I did everything unhurriedly, but with certainty. Andrew often appeared, not to interfere, but to support. Sometimes he would just write to check in. Sometimes he would send contacts for organic produce suppliers. One day, as we were looking at a small space for rent near the market, he asked, "Aren't you scared?" "Of what?" "Of failing." I thought for a second. Of course I'm scared. But if I don't try, I'll be more scared. Andrew nodded with understanding. In my 7th month of pregnancy, my belly was quite large, but I still tried to manage the preparations for my business opening. Dad drove me back and forth every day, and Mom always reminded me not to overwork myself. One night, Michael called again. This time, I answered. He asked how I was and if I needed help with the business. "That question is too late. I don't need it," I replied. He was silent, then said, "I know my words don't mean much anymore, but I'm truly sorry. I didn't argue or agree. I just said, okay." The brief conversation ended with Michael asking me to take care of my health. I hung up. My heart no longer fluttered. It was really over. A few weeks later, my mini catering business was finally ready. I didn't organize a big celebration for the opening. I just invited family and close friends. Mom cooked a celebratory dish. Dad hung the sign, and Andrew came early to help set up. "It looks great," he said with a smile. That night, after all the guests had left, I sat alone in my small establishment. The yellow light of the lamps illuminated the quiet space. I placed my hand on my stomach and whispered, "Mommy did it, honey." In response, I felt a slight kick. I felt so warm. The road ahead was still long, but I was no longer afraid because I knew I had enough strength to walk it. The last days of pregnancy passed peacefully. The business was gradually growing, and I reduced my work hours to get more rest. One morning, the first pains began. Mom quickly prepared everything, and Dad drove us to the hospital. In the delivery room, while enduring unimaginable pain, I forced myself to stay strong. When I heard my child's first cry, tears streamed down my cheeks. "A healthy girl," the doctor said, placing the tiny baby on my chest. I looked at her red, small, and so perfect. All the suffering I had gone through was worth it. Mom was crying with joy beside me. "You did it, honey." I named her Hannah, hoping her life would always be filled with peace and harmony, unlike what I had once gone through. The following days were filled with the new routine of caring for Hannah. It was hard, but every time I looked at her face, I forgot the fatigue. Mom was a huge help, doing almost all the housework so I could focus on my daughter. A month later, I gradually returned to my business, even if only for a few hours a day. Andrew still visited it often, sometimes bringing fruit, sometimes just to chat. One day, while I was holding Hannah, he said, "She looks just like you." I smiled. "I hope her personality isn't like mine used to be." Andrew looked at me. "But if her personality is like yours now, that would be wonderful." I just smiled in response. Time passed. Hannah grew into a cheerful child. One day I received a message from Jessica. She wanted to meet. I hesitated but eventually agreed. We met at a coffee shop. She looked completely different. Her face was dull, tired, and thin. "I was wrong," she said softly. "I didn't feel pride or anger. It's good that you understand that." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she continued. "I just want to say it for closure." I nodded. "That's enough." She was surprised by my calm reaction. "You don't hate me?" I thought for a second. "Before? Yes, but not anymore. I'm too busy with my own life." Jessica looked at me for a long time and then nodded. "You're stronger than I thought." Leaving the coffee shop, I felt completely free. I picked up Hannah from daycare. When she saw me, she laughed happily. I hugged her tightly. "It's all over, my child." That night, Andrew came with a gift for Hannah. "A small silver bracelet for good luck," he said. I looked at Andrew, then at Hannah, and my heart filled with warmth. Life isn't always easy, but after passing through the storm, we appreciate the rainbow even more. I am no longer the woman from 7 years ago who could only silently swallow her grievances in the kitchen. I am the Althea of today, capable of standing on her own 2 feet, choosing her own path, and knowing what she deserves. As night fell, I put Hannah to sleep and sat by the window, watching the city lights. I smiled. In life, losses are inevitable, but because of them, we learn to hold on tighter to what is truly ours. And this time, I will not let go. Reflecting on this whole story, I understood something that perhaps everyone should learn. Patience directed at the wrong people only becomes a reason for them to continue to oppress you. The old Althea endured not because she was weak, but because she believed. She believed in family, in love, in loyalty, but life is not built on one person's faith alone. It depends on the true character of the people by your side. My mistake was not in loving or sacrificing, but in trusting people who were not worthy. But because of this mistake, I discovered my true worth. They say kindness is rewarded with kindness, but sometimes that kindness only comes after we have gone through pain and loss. This grace is not just luck. It is the result of awakening. In retrospect, Jessica paid for her greed. Michael, he wasn't a complete villain, but he lacked the courage to stand up for the truth. And a man who cannot protect his small family ultimately loses it. And me, what I received was not justice according to the law. It was a new life. A life where I no longer have to pretend to be liked by anyone. A life where I know my own.